Well, good morning, everybody, and I hope that everyone is ready to start. If anyone who's on the screen can see me, can just give me a wave or a quick thumbs up. Fantastic, great. We are all in a process of tremendous innovation these days, and this morning's event or this afternoon's event is part of it. So let me start by saying greetings, everyone. Assalamu alaikum to everyone who is watching. And it is a delight to be here in this morning's virtual B20. My name is Gillian Tett. I'm with the Financial Times, and I am thrilled to be serving as the moderator for this morning's event. Now, everyone who is watching can follow the conversation on Twitter through the handle at B20 or the hashtag B20Virtual. Now, the theme of this morning's event is reviving business for a new normal. And I think this is a very important issue to be discussing because here in New York, where I'm sitting, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York State, came out yesterday and said that the key goal for going forward was to be build it back better. Build it back better. It's very similar to a tag created by the filmmaker Richard Curtis, the person who made wonderful movies like Love Actually and Four Weddings and a Funeral. Some of you may have been watching to pass the time. He launched a tagline of simply, build back better. And that concept actually goes back to World War II, because in the weeks after the end of World War II in Europe, there was a concept of Build Back Better being a rallying cry, not just for government, but for business and civil society. And it's going to be a very important issue as we look forward to life after COVID-19. Because COVID-19 has caused extraordinary disruption around the world. Tremendous tragedy and pain and tremendous disruption. But as anybody who's ever worked in Silicon Valley knows, disruption can mean both things. It can also mean devastating crises, but it can also mean tremendous opportunity. And in many ways, what we're seeing today is a chance to have, if you like, a reset of global business and the global order with all the opportunities that it brings. So we're going to hear a lot about that this morning from all the different participants. We have an amazing lineup who I will introduce as they come on in these 3 or 4 different segments that are looming. But first of all, I'd like to begin by introducing the chair of the B20 Saudi Arabia, Mr. Yousef Al-Benyan, who is the vice chairman and CEO of SABIC, one of the world's largest petrochemical manufacturers. So please welcome Mr. Yousef Al-Benyan to give us a few words to start off this morning or this afternoon's or this evening's event.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And again, I am really inspired by your positive and optimistic remarks, Gillian. This is good. And I hope everybody is safe and sound. And also, at the same time, you're putting a pressure on me because you said a few words, so it means that you do it quickly. But I'll do my best. Again, in the beginning, I would like to welcome our great guest, also His Excellency Dr. Fahad Mubarak is the G20 Sherpa, and this is really an honor to have him and to address the B20. And in the same time, our distinguished audience of business leaders and health experts for joining us today in this virtual meeting. As all of us are fully aware, we are facing a very challenging time. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a powerful impact on all corners of our lives and in the same time in our operations and our society, including our business. The global economy is suffering with a grim outlook, threatening our short-term horizon. Leaders and citizens alike are looking for ways to adapt quickly to a new order that change and enhance our way of managing the challenges, and not only from a business perspective, but of course to protect our health. A global health and social and economic ramifications can only be solved through international collaborations. Governments must partner with healthcare community, business and civil society alike to respond to this current crisis. This is why we are all gathered here today. As the official voice of the private sector to the G20, the B20 has called for urgent and coordinated efforts to contain the impact of COVID-19 on business and a global workforce as well. The recent meeting, G20 Leaders Summit, was a crucial step towards much-needed global coordination. The B20 fully support the G20 and commits the challenging that efforts and collective programs that they have announced, and we will be strategic partners to achieve their objectives and goals. B20 Saudi Arabia recently announced an initiative to address the impact of COVID-19 in addition to the future crisis that could have similar or even more impact on a global business and financial markets. Through these initiatives, the B20 will review a series of issues that build the foundation for operating business global, that also will help not only today, but also future customers and employees and society alike. Based on the results of this work, we will then develop a set of impactful, action-oriented policy recommendations that will be handed to our G20 leaders. The impact of a pandemic on a global economy has been a big time challenging for all of us. A global recession is underway, and international organizations expect very challenging global environments. At the same time, millions of workers have lost their jobs, and millions more will be at the challenging environments for unemployment as well. Around the world, businesses are taking steps to adapt to the new scenarios, which can very much impacted by country to a country. While some parts of the world are slowly slowing promising signs in the fight of COVID-19, others have not yet started and reached the peak. But what all we have here in common is that a little more than 3 months we have learned lessons and developed best practices to mitigate the damage of pandemic is causing to our society and economies. At a time like this, we must unleash our creativity and our ability to innovate. Technology be a key ally for business and employees on the road to return to work and to restart our global economy. Many of these mechanisms we are putting in place and perfecting day as we are facing the pandemic will be a key ensuring to help to coordinate effort to address the future crisis. We must guarantee the visibility of millions of small businesses across the world upon which many workers and families rely on. The 5 trillion injections already announced by the G20 is a good initial response, but more may yet be required. Then together governments and business must decide which are the next steps that we will follow to start easing the lockdowns in place in most of the world in order to restart the economy safely. Today, very important events and meetings. In the first several sessions, we will host a gathered leaders from business, civil society, government, and international organizations such as yourself. Your opinions are very valuable, and your leadership on this matter is very critical to galvanize members of the business community around cohesive, actionable plan to tackle these issues at hand. Our hope is that today you will walk away with very important best practices and insight, while also feeling empowered to do your part in combating this global crisis. A united front in this only way for us as all together to emerge out of this crisis. Time again, we have joined force to combat common global challenges, and I hope we will succeed. For sure, COVID-19 is the starting point, but if history is an indicator, I am confident that we will be able to defeat it and really have a prosperous future coming. At the end, I would like to thank all of you for your commitment. We as the B20 and the voice of the global business community assure you that we will work hand in hand with our G20 leaders and all our global organizations to make sure that we are overcoming this crisis and bring life to normality. Thank you very much.
And next, I would like to introduce the G20 Sherpa, Mr. Fahad Al-Mubarak, who is a Minister of State and a member of the Saudi Arabian Council of Ministers. Please welcome Mr. Fahad Al-Mubarak, who's going to be talking to us about some of the key commitments for business that emerged from the recent Extraordinary G20 Leaders Summit.
Thank you very much, Gillian. And let me first start by thanking the chair, Mr. Yousef Al-Benyan, and his colleagues, and for the excellent work has been done by the B20. Following the guidance by our moderator, I do have a very long written speech, but I'm going to go ahead and just share with you from my heart some of the points. First, let me offer my deepest condolences for all the lives lost and best wishes for those infected to recover, and the best of health for you and your loved one, everyone. And that I wish that we all come out of this in better health and cover our society and humanity as well as our economies. I think the B20 is one of the most important engagement groups that is complementary and that is important part of the G20 agenda and the G20 presidency in 2020. They have been working very hard more than a year ago, the leadership of Mr. Yousef Al-Benyan, and they have a very ambitious agenda and program that I think it should be pursued. We've also been working for over 2 years to prepare our agenda. We have very clear priorities and issues that are facing the world. And we have a theme of realizing opportunities of the 21st century, where we are planning to enable people, safeguard the planet, as well as opening new frontiers. All those programs continue to be on. However, we are all faced with this unprecedented situation, this health crisis that spread everywhere. And as we say, global crises require global cooperation. G20 was created to actually face up to global crisis. Back in 1999, after the Asian crisis, it was created at the level of finance ministers and central bank governors. Subsequently, it has been elevated to leaders level after the global financial crisis back in 2008 and 9. And here we go now. We are faced with a very, very big problem that no one country, no one region can overcome this challenge. This is why we need to work together collectively. And as a recognition of this, the custodian of two holy mosques, King Salman, have called for the first time in the history of the G20 for an extraordinary leaders summit, a virtual summit, as a responsible group. And indeed, all the leaders have responded positively and have participated effectively in that leaders summit. What is even more important is that this leader summit have produced a very powerful leader statement where they addressed many issues from combating this disease to preparing the future to avoid such situation as well. And both, it is a short term where the leaders have called for immediate action and immediate response and full support to international health organizations to both to develop vaccines, preparedness, treatment, distribution. not only in all our countries, but especially and specifically for developing and less developed countries. This is very important. Following also the leaders' commitment, they called for assessment of the International Health Organization for any gaps and trying to, or overlaps, in order to streamline and make sure that such phenomena do not happen in the future. And Saudi Arabia, as committed in the leaders' declaration, have committed $500 million in order to participate in the $8 billion called by the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board under the UN, which that money needed in order for us to face the current challenge. We also held 2 finance ministers meetings and a trade minister meeting. And yesterday we had, or 2 days ago, we held health minister meeting. And today, as we talk, there is an agriculture meeting. In the next couple of weeks, we have employment, tourism, and other ministerials. So we are doubling down. And with the pandemic, we are doing more in order to further cooperate among ourselves and work with international organizations. However, we are also maintaining our agenda, and we continue to pursue the initial priorities we have identified. However, it is more twisted toward addressing specifically also the current situation. For example, employment are focusing on the new way of work and working from home, education, addressing the online education issues, and health is focusing more on the pandemic specifically. Tourism are trying to find ways to save the industry. So we are addressing the main issues and the other issues. I'm also must say that I'm quite impressed and very, very thankful and grateful to the B20 under the leadership of Mr. Yousef Al-Benyan. You also have not been ignoring the situation. On the contrary, since the breakout, you have addressed the situation and you issued 3 very important statements, from the joint statements with the L20 and B20, W20 in employment, skills, and women, as well as in the B20 initiative to address specifically COVID-19, and also bringing a statement on finance and trade. This important reaction from the B20 is very important. And I think the business community as a private sector has a very, very important role to play in this crisis, both individually and collectively. Collectively, as we are working here with the B20, working with the international organization, contributing and sharing experience with other countries and other companies, but also individually in dealing with your employees and developing safety net and protecting your businesses, because inshallah, as we say, recovery will come soon, and we need your businesses to be stronger than ever in order to make up for the time lost and be able to turn the corner and bring the economy to much higher growth to make up for the lost area. In the Leaders' Declaration, we have addressed many issues in supporting the private sector. We have addressed the supply chain, and specifically for equipment and supplies for the health industry, which is needed more than ever. We need to improve and have a stronger health systems in order to reopen up for businesses, for your businesses to come back. But in the meanwhile, we need to work together. And the business community is very important for us. I hope that you will work with the employment working group and ministers, with the health ministers, with the finance ministers, and with the, all other ministers in order to communicate what does the business recommend, what can we do as a G20 in order to support your business. I don't want to take too long, but I would like to really thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for inviting me to share a few words with you. And I really apologize. I have to join actually 7 minutes the Global Solutions in Berlin for a very large another international gathering where I have to also participate by giving a keynote speak there and participate in a panel. Otherwise, I would love to have heard, but I promise you I'm going to look up the video recording of this very important speakers and join you then. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very, very successful plenary. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Mubarak. Thank you for your words. As you say, inshallah, we are indeed going to have a recovery at some point soon. But before we look forward, we need to, if you like, take stock of the global response on handling the pandemic so far. And we're going to have two fantastic people to start this first panel. We're going to have Dr. David Nabarro, who is the World Health Organization Special Envoy for COVID-19, who's going to give us a perspective on the WHO's vision of where we are right now with this pandemic, and also Mr. Paul Polman, who is the chairman of the International Chamber of Commerce and a long-standing champion for trying to create a better path for business. Now, Dr. Nabarro is running a little late because he is very busy dealing with all the WHO issues, so he is going to be joining us in a few minutes. So I'm going to actually turn, first of all, to Paul Polman to give us some perspective from the private sector and the world of business about what's happening. And good morning, Paul. Great to have you here. I'm curious, in the last few years, you have often been quite critical of business. You have challenged business to raise its game, often in very blunt terms. I'm curious, if you look at how the business community has responded so far, what kind of grade would you give them if they were in school? Would you be giving them an A, B, C, D, or a homeschool probably, since many of us are homeschooling right now? So what grade would you give the homeschooling business community right now for their performance so far?
Well, I am Dutch, and we grade tough. We give each other tough grades, Gillian. So overall, I'd say a B+, and I explain that in a minute. Can you see me? Is this working? Or?
We can indeed see you, and it's great to have you here. Thank you.
No, thank you. And first of all, I want to thank the Saudis, who are obviously leading the G20 efforts at a very crucial time, but also taking it very seriously, and the amount of time that they have spent on working this, and together with the B20, which I participate in. I can only say that Yousef and his team, Mohammed, who leads the Energy, Sustainability and Climate Task Force as the chair, and then also obviously the Honorable Minister who joined us, Fahad, Al-Mubarak, want to really thank them for their efforts. Coming to your question, Gillian, we've actually been pleasantly surprised. There is no question about it that the business community was ill prepared for this, as was the global community at large, and the shock has been enormous. I don't think any business person in any business had to deal with what we did over the last few weeks. And overwhelmingly, with a few exceptions, I would say business has risen to the challenge. Undoubtedly, we all understand that the first priority of business is to ensure that they maintain going concerns and manage their cash flow or manage their liquidity, if you want to. And that's a very important thing that we shouldn't underestimate, because the more people business can keep employed, the less people actually end up in unemployment and have to deal with often very weak social protection systems. But next to that, we've seen enormous efforts by business itself, first and foremost to deal with the priority number one, which is employee health and safety. And then secondly, to support the WHO and others in attacking this health crisis. As Tedros from the WHO has said many times, this is a whole of society issue and not just a whole of government issue. And business has understood that very well. First of all, in providing the equipment and material needed where they could, in quickly changing many supply chains to make masks, protective gowns, but also incredible partnerships that probably were inconceivable a few weeks ago, where companies like Medtronic make their patents and trademarks openly available, where car companies go together with appliance companies and airplane manufacturers to make ventilators. And we see these partnerships happening in many different places. Hotels that are turned into hospitals, pharmacy companies that work together to find solutions, health and beauty companies to provide the sanitation products, fashion companies that work on the face masks, and that's a pleasure to see. So overall, I'd say a B+.
So why not, as my daughter would say, if you're saying such nice things, why not an A?
Because at the same time, I'd say it's a 60-40 balance. At the same time, we see leaders that don't get it. It's very clear that what has moved up in the ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is the social part. In the UK, 20% of the CEOs themselves finally have taken a pay cut of 20% or more some in solidarity with their workers. The social protection and understanding of the weaknesses of our social networks has really been filled by many businesses. But there are still some that are abusing it, that really don't get it, that might do some of the things and try to get a lot of publicity around that, but are not consistent in their actions. A meat factory in the US where 200 people have been identified with the coronavirus, when you have factories next door that have zero, show a total disrespect of people. Some who get a sue message that they are unemployed and don't even see a human face that has the dignity to tell them that, show a total disregard of people. We've seen price rises that were totally unnecessary, and we've seen companies that first and foremost prioritized their enormous wealth that they have created and not the other stakeholders in their value chains. But fortunately, I believe that is the minority, but they're pulling down the average rating. What we have seen in this crisis, Gillian, and that is very important, is that companies that already were exercising what I would call a longer-term multi-stakeholder model tend to do better
right.
now. They have a stronger financial position. You take the airlines, 95% of their free cash flow over the last 10 years went to share buybacks and special dividends. That's just financial magouilla. I've always said that, and I will continue to say that. And not surprisingly, they're the first ones that call for state aid. I saw some companies. Right. I saw some companies operating from tax havens. Obviously, if you're operating from tax havens, don't expect the U.S. or the European governments to bail you out. But yet they have the courage to ask for it. So right. I think the consumer is starting to understand this. And your column that you have, which says saints and sinners, I think is a good column. What we now find is that 75% of the consumers expect the companies to behave consistently and responsibly. And when they don't, they get punished for that very quickly. And this is actually a proof that we see increasingly that companies that have already operated under this multi-stakeholder model have more engaged employees to deal with this. This is an enormous stress on the individuals, mentally, physically. When we're all in this lockdown mode, they have better relationships with their suppliers to manage these enormous value chain disruptions. They have a stronger financial position. And yes, society at large wants to work with these companies in these new partnerships I talked about that make them more right. robust. Not only doing better now, but also coming out better.
Well, thank you. That's terrific. And by the way, I should explain that the Saints and Sinners column that Paul Polman referred to is part of a Financial Times series looking at how companies are responding to the current crisis. And we will be going into more discussion going forward about how they build back better. But before we turn to the future and companies, I'd like to welcome David Nabarro, who has joined us from his insanely busy day at the moment with the WHO as a special envoy trying to combat the COVID-19. And I should start by saying, on behalf of all of us watching, thank you for your service and good luck. And please hurry up and find a solution for all of us who are online. No pressure there.
No pressure.
I've just asked Paul Polman what grade he would give the corporate sector in terms of its response to COVID-19. He gives it a B+. What grade, David, would you give to the governmental and non-governmental world in terms of its response?
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Gillian. And greetings to you all. Sorry to be late. I'd like to greet the chair, Mr. Yousef Al-Benyan. It's lovely to be with you, sir. I'd like to greet His Excellency Fahad Al-Mubarak. I'd like to greet everybody, and I hope that I am observing protocols properly. But I'm going to not be a gentleman of protocol today, Gillian, because I actually think we have to be pretty straight about what's happening. Some governments are doing really well. Other governments are doing much less well. The governments that experienced an outbreak of another coronavirus in 2003 called SARS learnt the really hard way that if you don't pay attention as soon as you have people with the disease in your societies, if you don't isolate them quickly, stop transmission of this virus, and basically make sure that you suppress outbreaks the moment they start. If you don't do that, suddenly you find yourself with a huge problem, with a lot of suffering, overloaded health workers, large numbers of older people dying, and general dislocation to the whole of your national economy and society. And so compare, for example, Singapore with some European countries. Singapore has been ahead of this virus all the time. It knows what to do, it does it. That doesn't mean that it's without problems. Singapore knows that if people come back into their country, bring the virus, and they go into some of the places where there are quite dense populations of people, then there will be a new outbreak occurring, and it can get very bad very quickly. But Singapore knows to expect that, knows that as soon as you get that, you lock down again, you find the people who are infected, you isolate them, and you suppress the outbreak. And the rest of life goes on. And that's going to be, I believe, what Singapore is doing, an example of the right way to do it. Or consider Germany, where they've got widespread, well-developed, planned-out public health capacity across society. As soon as people who've got disease, they're reported, they're identified, they're isolated, their contacts are traced incredibly rigorously, they're isolated, outbreaks are stopped. Yes, it causes disturbance where it happens, but the rest of the country can go on. That's going to be the shape of our world for the foreseeable future, is that capacity to close down outbreaks quickly. The countries that have got caught and have got into difficulty are the countries where leaders said, perhaps this isn't very serious. Perhaps we'll just let it affect all our people. It's just like a mild flu, and we won't worry about it. What they did not realize was that societies are not prepared to tolerate overloaded health workers, overloaded health services, and health workers dying. They're not prepared to tolerate hundreds of older people in residential homes dying, and they're not prepared to tolerate the complete sense of panic and fear that it introduces. This is nothing like flu. It is nothing like anything else we've ever seen before in my professional life. Every government has to take it seriously. So the high marks go to the governments that took it seriously at the beginning, have closed it down, have shown how to do things. I picked out Singapore, I picked out Germany, but there are others that I could have picked out. The lower marks go to the countries that have absolutely not done that.
Well, thank you very much. Yes,
if I may
Paul.
add to this very quickly, we have seen 75 countries putting export barriers in place for PPE material to protect their own, whilst actually easing import restrictions. So that is close to asocial behavior when you have a global crisis like this that needs a global solution. We've also seen some countries react fast, but relatively slow when it gets to the financial aid packages. Even now, we're still debating many things with the finance ministers in Europe if we should be helping Southern Europe when we know that we have a crisis and we know people are dying. When the SMEs are absolutely strained and need support, 80% of the economy. We've been slow to react, and we should acknowledge that. There is no global mechanism really that is dealing with this. And even worse, we find ourselves in than what it was 10 years ago. And then finally, what is of great concern to me and the business community, and David will undoubtedly agree with that, is that we just don't show this global solidarity when we have the emerging markets are now being hit by this incredible tragic event, and frankly are not capable to deal with it. We see capital outflows, they don't have borrowing facilities, remittances not coming in, they have a healthcare system that is very fragile, and we're just navel gazing. I thought first and foremost, at least I came on this world, to be part of planet humanity, and that we are first and foremost connected. So we do need to hold our political leaders up to a higher level. And that is exactly what the B20 has been calling for, what the International Chamber of Commerce and others have been calling for. But statements don't do anything to fight this virus. This virus doesn't listen to statements. It really needs to see these actions now from these heads of state.
Well, maybe one thing the B20 should be doing is to actually issue a scorecard on governments and work out who gets an A and who gets an F. Because one interesting development, it's not just countries like Singapore that have been doing well. It's a number of other smaller countries too, be that Taiwan or one of my favorites, New Zealand, where the Prime Minister has managed to not only curb the problem, but communicate with a level of honesty that's very admirable, and even declare that the Easter Bunny was going to be a protected worker, which I thought was a wonderful line. But
so New Zealand, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, wonderful Prime Minister. Costa Rica, great, but suffering terrible problems. There's so many examples of leadership, and many poor countries have really moved fast and are getting high marks, so they're going to face terrible problems. Just to echo what Paul said, Gillian, honestly, this is a global crisis. This is affecting 7.8 billion people. There is a massive hunger crisis. There is a crisis for older people. There is an unemployment crisis. There is a crisis in the whole law and order sector. What on earth are leaders doing? Really? What on earth?
Well, that's throwing down the challenge to any leaders watching. So, in practical terms, what would you think the top priorities are for governments and for business going forward? I mean, if you had a wish list of the top 2 or 3 steps that need to happen right now, David, do you want to jump in and then Paul?
Yeah, thanks very much. I've said that as we emerge from the current big outbreaks, it's going to be necessary for every country to be ready to deal with any new outbreaks of COVID that emerge and to have rapid lockdown capacity in place so that they can get operating. But you know, if we just keep working on this with individual countries getting themselves COVID ready, where's there going to be an opportunity for international cooperation? Where's there going to be an effort to try to make sure that poorer countries, as Paul said, are able to be part of the new world where we are going to need to have much more trust and much more basic public health capacity to keep people safe? So my absolute requirement now is proper cooperation between countries, not to try to point the finger of blame, not to try to score points, not to try to in any way undermine each other, but in a spirit not just of solidarity, but a spirit of humanity. Because otherwise it's going to be really hard for poor countries to be continuing to be part of the global economic system that they thought they were part of. They're going to get left behind. They're going to get cordoned off. And so my number 1 is this cooperation for the sake of global humanity and our future. My number 2 is very much on the supply chains. It is, for me, continuing to be disturbing that health workers in poor countries cannot be protected against the effect of this virus because rich countries have commandeered the majority of the protective equipment. That's where, again, global leadership and cooperation is key, because without that, you cannot develop a fair system for prioritizing those who are weaker in power but greater in need. Thirdly, of course, we've got to have joint working on diagnostics that really help you know who's got the virus super fast where you are. And that probably is the most important game changer right now. Probably needs about $1 billion to really get it set up, to get the necessary work done. For me, that's a tiny price. And there should be half a billion on the table now to help the manufacturers get themselves going so that the systems that already exist for HIV/AIDS can be turned into being suitable for COVID. But really simple systems that can be used anywhere, even at an aircraft, at a check-in gate in an airport. And then we need treatments, and then we need vaccine. But basically they're in that order. And that's because the priority now is knowing who has the virus and who doesn't. Those are my kind of medical priorities. I now hand back to you for the more important stuff coming from Paul.
So basically, key steps. Step one, get the global coordination right. Two, get the supply chain working. And three, get the science engaged to actually testing, vaccine, and hopefully some solution. That's a pretty clear-cut roadmap. Let's hope there are some global leaders listening. Paul.
Well, as you can imagine, David and I work so closely together that we look eye to eye, and I can echo what he says. But I just wanted to focus a little bit more on the private sector in your question, if I may. And there's no doubt that the first priority will continue to be to safeguarding lives. Second priority, I would say, safeguarding livelihoods. But then we also need to design for something better. Many countries are now looking at exit scenarios and what they're looking like. And David has explained to us the medical and the science technicalities and challenges in doing that. But we do need to design a better future. There is no doubt that the fact that we're dealing with this virus is in itself not a black swan. We have viruses every 2 or 3 years in this world. This just is a ghastly one. And it's again because of the relationships between biodiversity, climate change, and human health. And we can avoid the big black swan, as you rightfully said, is not the virus itself. It's probably the lack of leadership and collaboration that we see at the global level. And what we need to do now is we need to design better. This is not a question about restarting the economy, as I hear people say. This is a question of redesigning the economy. We need better health systems. We need to protect our biodiversity. We need to get to a green growth, and we need to make this growth more inclusive. And frankly, it makes a lot of sense. Just if you look at the climate change itself, that's an opportunity to create more jobs, 65 million. And boy, do we need them right now. It's an opportunity to unlock $26 trillion in incremental GDP. And frankly, an opportunity to save 4 million lives a year that are now unnecessarily dying from air pollution. And you know also with COVID, by the way, that the poorest people suffer most from air pollution and are again the ones who pay the highest price of this. So my point is very simple. Design right for the future. Create a future that is more productive, that is more pleasant to live in, has higher quality jobs, is more inclusive. And that requires not only a green economy, it requires a new social contract as well. It is surprising that we now, not surprising actually, but for many it is surprising that we now see the underbelly of our gig economy, where the majority of the people in this world are still in an informal economy, not protected by any social network, or they're in a gig economy where they're totally dependent on themselves. And as soon as the plug is pulled out, they're left swimming. In the US alone, 1 in 4 has no access to sick pay. 60% have no extended medical leave for situations like this. We cannot live in a world like this. So we need to create a social network that is more robust. And then we need to look at a few other systems. Our food and land use system, fundamentally broken. Our global governance system, fundamentally broken, and can be redesigned. And then, not surprisingly, our healthcare system. It is not designed to deal with these things, and I hope we take our lessons from that. So coming out stronger, creating this future that is more sustainable, more equitable, more inclusive, is, I think, where we all want to be part of.
Right. We haven't got much time left. I should have mentioned earlier that anyone watching who wants to send a question to any of the panelists can type it in through the Q&A function, and I will absorb that into the conversation. So if you want to send a quick question, please do. But otherwise, in the last few minutes we have, I'd like to ask you both, not to be too gloomy, what are the biggest risks to the outlook right now? what keeps you awake at night, or what else keeps you awake at night apart from the challenges we have right now?
Yeah, I think very quickly, then I'll let David end. I think falling back in the old way of doing things, a global governance system that becomes worse instead of better. There's a risk even for Europe. Do we have a Europe? Are we choosing solidarity above sovereignty? That would be my second risk. And the third one is social cohesion. We are having an enormous tension in the system, youth unemployment coming up. And are we choosing, like we did since the financial crisis, of polarizing this society more and giving the voices to the populists or the extremists and xenophobia? Or are we going to unite and creating a society that works for all of us? We actually are the leaders that can decide what future we want to have. It's up to us to decide that. We can freeze away from each other and pay even more dear consequences than what we see now, or we can work together and create this inclusive world that we all aspire to live in. In fact, we don't have a choice, Gillian.
Right, right. David, what are the risks for you? And by the way, we've also got a question which is saying, what rules and regulations would you change now to stem the coronavirus pandemic in poorer nations? How can you use social or legal pressure to encourage rich nations to help? So you can either talk about the risk, David, or you can address the question of how we actually get more global coordination at a practical level.
Thanks very much indeed. Right. This tiny virus is actually going to be the catalyst for collective action in our world in line with the principles of equity and justice. And the reason why it's going to be a catalyst is that over time, and it'll be very quick, Gillian, because everything is happening exponentially. It's not happening in a linear way. So quite quickly, leaders will come to understand that they cannot afford to go on bickering and disagreeing, whether it's in local communities or inside countries or globally. All the difficulties that we've had with coronavirus in the last few weeks basically have resulted from leaders finding it hard to align their thinking and to get organized and do what really needs to be done. But over time, they realize that the longer you wait, the more the damage. So my big anxiety is the following, that it will take so long for leaders to realize what Paul just said, that they have to work together in order to deal with this threat, that the amount of damage that this virus will cause to our systems in society will be very great. And the recovery, once the leaders do decide to work together, will be very much harder. It's really a simple one. They'll get it sooner or later, and of course they'll work together, but in too many cases, the delay will be too long. And that is my worry. And of course, long delay means the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Global solidarity falls apart. There's a total loss of confidence among people in the capacity of their leaders to lead. In many countries, there's a complete loss of any respect for governance. And this will lead to, in essence, ungovernability in many nations throughout our world. Now, what are the regulations we've got to deal with? Mostly the international health regulations, which is the overlying document that mandate that determines what WHO can do and can't do. The WHO is not allowed, for example, to go and inspect countries, find out what's going on. Those powers just do not exist. They were very deliberately not given to the WHO in 2005. WHO has to inquire of every country by law, this is an international law, why they impose travel restrictions, banning people from certain countries coming into their place. This is not the whim of the Director General or the whim of technicians like myself who work in WHO. This is a legal document negotiated over 2 years between 2003 and 2005 that sets the rules. That's got to be changed urgently. Governments, instead of poking little nasty things at each other, ought to be sitting together saying immediately, how do we rewrite the international health regulations to deal with the problems we've got now, as the questioner just asked. So my answer is every business leader in the world should plead with every leader in the world to immediately start the work to review the international health regulations, if necessary, making a temporary new element to it so that we empower not just the World Health Organization, but everybody to rewrite the rules. Thank you. Sorry for too long.
No, well, thank you, David, for both those very strong and clear discussions about some of the challenges, but also some very practical steps for how to go forward. And thank you, Paul, for indicating how government can actually work with business to push this agenda forward and the responsibility of business. I think you said earlier, David, that what we need is common humanity. I think we also need common humility, because one thing the virus has done is shown that being big is no protection, having global footprint is no protection, being a developed country is no protection. We all need to learn from each other with a renowned sense of humility, whatever our cultural backgrounds and cultural differences, because none of us have the perfect answer. So thank you very much indeed. There are sadly many questions being asked now, which I would love to pose to both of you, but we were going to have to move on to the next session, which is a fantastic chance, having set the scene on a macro level, to look at what's actually happening on the ground inside companies. And we have two extremely interesting global businessmen joining us this morning or this afternoon. Mr. Francesco Starace, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Enel, a multinational energy company and one of the world's leading integrated electricity and gas operators, and also Werner Baumann, who is Chief Executive Officer of Bayer, who has recently been talking with various members of the US government about how to combat the virus through the company's large suite of products. So two CEOs who are absolutely in the hotspot right now. It's extremely kind of them to have come and joined us in their very busy schedules to give us their perspective. I should say to both of you, have you had any sleep at all in recent days, given how crazy the current events are? But as before, two things. One of all, I'd like to say, if anyone wants to ask any questions as we chat, please do add them into the Q&A as we speak. And secondly, as we are talking about the outlook going forward, please do share us some ideas about how it looks from your perspective in the C-suite right now. Perhaps we could start with Mr. Baumann about how things look from the perspective of Bayer.
Yeah, hi, Jillian, and hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay.
We can indeed hear you. I don't think we can actually see you. Yes, we can, certainly. One of the great challenges of this period of extraordinary disruption is we're all having to learn new technological skills at the speed of light, which hopefully will bear us in good stead for the future. So welcome, Mr. Baumann.
Well, thank you, Jillian, and hello, everybody. First of all, I'd say if somebody had come to our company and asked us about 12 months ago to run a big pilot to take the company virtual for a few months, we would have said that that person would be outright crazy, and we said it would just not be doable. And as a matter of fact, we are doing it right now, like many other company organizations do it as well. Things work, they have to work. Our people are doing everything in their power in order to make sure that we can deliver products to those in need. Very importantly, with what the purpose of our company is, Science for a Better Life, very much in health and nutrition. And while doing that, of course, it's also important to stay healthy and safe, which is another major focal area. And to that extent, of course, everybody is going to get a good dose of sleep. Not as much as normally, of course, but we are kind of hanging in there. And it's actually great to see what a good purpose of a company does when people really see how big the impact is they make day in, day out to those in need.
Well, thank you. What has been the biggest challenge so far before I turn to Mr. Starace?
the biggest challenge has actually been to keep our supply networks going. And there are a number of challenges when it comes to cross-border logistics, when it comes to having access to products that are available globally, but your governments choose to put export restrictions on. And then, of course, keeping our plants running also means significant security and safety measures that we have to take in order to avoid infection and cross-infection of our workforce. Those have been the two biggest. And the third one is, of course, keeping our IT running, which with that substantial incremental volume that goes through our networks was a big task at hand that our people have just managed fabulously.
Right. Well, certainly the question of how resilient the IT system is one that we've all suddenly had to think about a lot. And the point about supply chains was actually touched upon earlier in the earlier panel, because that's certainly a big headache for many companies right now. But Mr. Starace, how is it from your perspective, from your what looks like your library?
Yes. Well, this is a library, but the people that work in Enel are now in 21 different geographies, and they are all experimenting with what David Nabarro clearly indicated, a variety of lockdown modes in a variety of time zones. So, the COVID crisis does not hit the world at the same time. So we are experiencing from Korea to Russia through Europe, in the United States and most of Latin America, an incredible combination of different ways of locking down people to prevent COVID-19 to spread. And I subscribe with what he said. There are governments that knew from the beginning how to handle this crisis, governments that learned by doing, and we are in Europe in this phase, I guess, more or less, and governments that had a better chance to learn from other mistakes, but not all of them are using that experience in the right way. So I don't want to make names, but the experience is that you have to take it very, very, very early, very, very, very seriously, and that's what we've done. Our first preoccupation has been the safety of all our colleagues, all our people working in all our premises. What we do, electricity, is something that is always needed, and in particular, when people are locked at home, you must make sure the lights are always on. You cannot tolerate to have no power while being locked at home in this kind of situation. So we totally focused on, first, the safety of our employees and our people on the ground. Second, do only the things that have to do with continuity of service and put everything else aside while the lockdown is on. And that has been the focus of the last 5 weeks, 6 weeks, I would say. I'm losing count. Now 6 weeks. And
I think time is blending for everybody, and it's hard to remember which day we're in.
I think this is going to be probably unwinding in front of us in the next few months as lockdowns are lifted, and then probably outbreaks need to be contained. So we are going to manage through this transient until this virus is defeated by some kind of cure or hopefully a vaccine. But I think it will take time, and we are prepared for this marathon. It's going to be, in our opinion, a very long marathon, longer than what people think.
Right. I'm curious, before I turn to some of the specific policy questions and how you're engaging with governments and your investors, I'm just curious to ask you both, is there anything that has come as a pleasant surprise in this disruption in recent weeks? And are there any things that you've learned to do differently that you think you will keep in place going forward? I mean, has there been, they say necessity is the mother of invention. Is there anything that actually you feel quite pleased to have learned in the crisis? Mrs. Starace, and then I'll ask Head Baumann.
Maybe what I can say is that we have been surprised by the incredible adaptation that we have all been capable of displaying in this transient. We are working in a completely digital cyberspace, and we started doing that and went out in there all together in 10 days, seamlessly. To be honest, we have put everything in the cloud at our level, so we don't have any more servers to be worried about, and I think that was somewhat helped us. But the way in which we have now learned to play on the digital field is an accelerated collective crash course of digital transformation as we never had the courage to even think of. And that is going to stay with us forever. We're not going to forget it. It will change mostly the way in which we work. There is also another thing. We have streamlined and thrown away all superfluous ways of thinking that were still in our company, and that I guess there are in all companies, because these stressful times freed us from all kinds of external considerations and only focused on the essence of our job. So there has been, how can I say, a cleanup of minds that was extremely useful. Plus, we have found an incredible team spirit. I mean, there is a strange combination. We're all far away, isolated in our homes. You know, we cannot even look at each other in the eyes because we're so off one from the other. But in this cyberspace, we are more united and more cohesive than before. So there has been an incredible response from people about this during this crisis that I think we will carry through this after the crisis is finished.
Interesting. So I trained as a cultural anthropologist, so I'm fascinated by how human systems and cultures change over time. But so crash course in tech, a streamlining of objectives, and a renewed realization of the value of teamwork and, frankly, having a real-life human being from time to time, not just your computer screen.
Yeah.
Herr Baumann, what have you learned, or what have you learned? Would you echo those points, or are there other things you've learned which you've been pleasantly surprised about?
Yeah, I can certainly echo what Francesco said, Jillian. The comments and additions I would make is there's something really strange and actually very gratifying that we have seen, and that is something that I would call the rediscovery of humanity. Where so all of a sudden, the things that really matter come to the forefront, and people go out of their way to help. And since we are part of our business is healthcare and pharmaceuticals, it is really incredible what our people have been moving and very much self-motivated. Yeah, they've seen something that they can do something and that they can help. For example, in our labs, we have PCR testing capacities, and it was their initiative to say, hey, we lack enough testing capacity. That's the most important thing, to have early testing in order to find people who are infected. So they essentially vacated our labs, put the equipment into commercial labs or operate them themselves in order to actually produce more tests. And we've seen many, many, many of those examples. And the other thing that I've learned is that the word impossible is not in existence right now. Whatever it is, we can make it happen and we can make it work. And that goes also cross organizations. So it's not inside of the company only, but reaching out, working with governments, getting things done quickly, having also government support, frankly, with very, very quick turnaround of legislation is actually a great experience where your people struggled before month after month to get something done. All of that has gone away. What matters and what is really important is what the task at hand is that we need to solve, and that's exactly what we do right now. On a personal note, of course, normally we have very busy travel schedules, and we have to be 5 different places during a couple of days. That is gone as well, so it's also some slowing down, still being very busy, and it gives also some quality time with the family at home.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see whether this lasts, a year after the crisis is over. But I'm curious, going forward in terms of how you imagine your company's interaction with society and your dealings with investors and stakeholders, you both as companies have been stressing your stakeholder strategy as much as shareholder strategy. But do you think it's going to change what investors expect from you, what governments expect from you, how you relate to stakeholders more broadly?
Which one?
You want to go first?
Well, you can choose who would like to go first. Maybe Francesco.
Well, I think in a way this is a confirmation of a trend that was already underway. Okay, in this sense, I think COVID-19 just accelerated brutally what the dynamic was already started to make sure that companies do not focus only on quarterly results, but also on longer-term sustainable practices that have to do with the society in which they operate within. And I think if there was a case that would, if there was a test that would make this so clear and so necessary, this is one. I mean, a company needs to address deeper and more important issues than just the quarterly results. Those need to be there, and perhaps maybe on a 6 months basis for some companies would be more appropriate, but I'm not questioning the reporting timing. But I think there is a deeper sense and a deeper mission that all companies have in different fields, and they need to find the roots that justify the existence of the company itself within the tissue of society. You know, for a utility, the name itself is very clear. It's a self-explanatory term. You are useful. You need to give some basic service, and the spirit of service that is deeply rooted into this company sometimes is just hidden below a stratification of mistakes. This COVID-19 made it extremely clear that is the essence of our being: provide convenient and uninterruptible clean energy to society. That's what the mission is, and that's what people really want to do. In that sense, I think COVID stressed it in a very big way. And I think governments now rely also much more on the mission of companies rather than what tax revenues they can scheme out of them and what dividends they can get out of them. They really need the companies to perform, providing their services and restarting the economy when it comes to investment. So I think governments really have today are discovering the value of the companies, not just for the economic content of their activity, but also for the social part that they can play.
Right.
Very important.
One little known detail about the word company that may appeal to you, Francesco, is the word company comes from the old Italian meaning compagno, with bread. Yes. And although exactly, it started life as a social entity, which in a sense we're now discovering, even though we can't actually eat bread together. But Werner, what about you? I mean, do you think that the way you present yourself to investors or deal with governments is going to change after this?
Well, I think we, personally, I have had always a commitment on this front. So I don't think I need to change that too much. Perhaps what can be, actually what is coming up is a shift of focus on some of the issues that COVID-19 has brought forward, and in the future will probably be a deeper and longer term discovery. The way in which we live in large metropolitan areas need to change. The way in which we live in cluster of human beings need to be more human. Right. And in this sense, the digital transformation can help a lot. So I think it will be a big change in the way in which we project sustainability, which has always been very much about climate change, and that will remain. But there is another dimension that is how people really live. And that's I think COVID is really stressing that.
Werner, what about you?
Well, first of all, you're answering also one of your earlier questions, Julian. It is very important to remember that your companies like ours did not come into existence in order to produce financial results. They came into existence because we could solve problems and satisfy human needs with the products and the solutions that we invented and have further evolved and developed ever since. And with it, we serve customers, patients, but we also serve and are an integral part of the communities which we live in and which we are an active part of. And that, of course, also includes the government. I think what has come out of the crisis is something that I touched on already, and that is that cooperation is actually, in times of crisis, actually strengthened, because being too stiff on rules and being too formal goes away because there is a huge sense of urgency. I think that has created a significant sense of appreciation of what companies are able to do in general, not only ours, but many others, when it comes to fast response. And I do hope that some of it will also survive going forward once we re-emerge out of the crisis and come back to some sort of new normal.
Right. We're talking about, a practical area of social engagement and political engagement. I think a question we'd all love to ask you, Werner, is not so much when will there be a vaccine or when can we expect proper testing, given your role in healthcare, although if you feel like telling us that, please do, because that is clearly top of everyone's mind. But what is it like to engage with government and society at a time like this, when there is so much pressure for quick solutions, quick communication, where everyone is desperately looking to groups like yourself for responses, and when, of course, you have governments saying, tweeting all kinds of things which you have to respond to? How are you coping with that?
Maybe I can try that, because.
Well, I guess.
Go ahead, Werner.
I have no, let's say, significant further insight beyond your part of what you already covered. The current perspective is that we will have vaccines sometime next year, certainly not this year. And we do actually increase, as we speak, across the entire healthcare spectrum, testing capacities. There are companies like Thermo Fisher, there are companies like QIAGEN, many others out there that are working feverishly to increase testing capacity and make it available around the world. And we are more on the medication side, where we have a few solutions that may prove to be helpful for the treatment of the disease early on, in order to get to a progression of the disease and eventually to cure patients without going into real severe ventilation status. So that is essentially what we are doing in that area, and government and people are really appreciating what we can do, and we are from time to time also surprised how fast we get things done now. That's certainly another element of surprise, that we can be actually very, very quick if need be.
Do you think that there's a danger, there's almost too much expectation of what you can or can't do? And how has it been to actually, forge this kind of collaboration, given that on the one hand you have pressure for international collaboration in the science field, and yet, as we've heard earlier in relation to supply chains, a tendency towards trying to sometimes cut supply chains off?
So these are two different topics, Jillian. One is that, first of all, we have to try and reach for the impossible in order to get the possible done. And in science and innovation, this is not entirely plannable, and it's not you can't time it and sequence it towards a certain point in time, because some of the things that we are doing also need proper regulatory framing in order to make sure that the products that are being developed, be it vaccines or new medicines, are safe. That's why we have the regulatory agency. So some of that will inevitably take more time than we would like it to take, but we also have huge responsibility in order to make sure that the products that we invent and ultimately produce and get to market, that they're really safe for people who are going to be needing them. The other piece on government interaction, and part of it also interference, is a different topic. Each government tries to control its own area of reach, and that has led to shutting down of borders, export controls, limiting limitations of product that can leave the country, ignoring the fact that we are living in a global world with global supply chains. And the result of what some governments are doing is the opposite of what is intended, because with the breakdown of some of these supply chains, nobody is going to have the access to the products that everybody needs. So on that one, I would very much wish and welcome a stronger alliance and coalition going forward, post-pandemic, to look at the learnings and get to a substantially better level of preparedness that leads to more and not less international and global cooperation going forward between the UN, the G20, involving the B20 and the WHO. I think that is what we need as a next step.
Right. Well, that's a theme which came up in the earlier panel and is certainly a very tangible area where the B20 can interact with the G20 and try and push the agenda forward. In some ways, perhaps it may even be the top priority going forward. But Francesco, would you agree?
Yes,
I can see David Nabarro nodding enthusiastically as well, thumbs up, because of course you are at the forefront, David, with the United Nations in trying to make sure that science and innovation and badly needed products keep moving around the world.
Just before I run off to my next thing, I just wanted to say, as I listened to these two great people speaking, you know, the one thing that business leaders were able to do on climate change was to persuade heads of state and government that they had to move. And it was really that the confidence of business leaders, and I think gave the license to many political leaders to do more. On this one, it's exactly the same, but it's much more urgent. Please do everything you can to persuade your political leaders that there are real dangers for the failure to collaborate, whether it's in the areas that Dr. Baumann just described, or the other areas that are so important. Collaboration is key, otherwise lives will be lost, but not just a few lives, it'll be thousands and thousands of lives. Thank you.
That's it. Thank you, David. And listen, as you rush off back to the WHO, all we can say is, on behalf of all of us, good luck, keep going, and let's hope that you have some success soon.
Thank you.
Francesco.
I have to add to what David said, that, it's strange because this COVID-19 is playing the same way over and over and over in different parts of the world. And political leaders should just look at what other leaders went through and just learn from that. But they seem to be always having to play a little bit of a game to say, no, we're different. This is not going to be the same here. We're going to tackle it in a different way. And inevitably, it's just a question of delays. They always end up in the same story. So what we've tried to do, because again, we have such a diversified presence, is when we saw the crisis hitting Europe and we had to rush into a lockdown, which was really difficult, but necessary in large countries like Spain and Italy, but then we did it in Greece, in Romania, in Russia. I mean, we did it everywhere. We just told the other side of the Atlantic, why don't we just prepare? Because this is just a question of time. The virus is already here, only it has not manifested itself fully. Don't think that you can shut it off. It's here already. And please, I have to say that it's difficult being a politician to take this kind of measures. I understand, because it's really complex to tell people stay at home when no one is really that sick, all right? But when you see what's going on around the world, maybe a little bit of courage helps. And we had mixed success in Latin America. Some countries listened, some others a lot less. So I think all we can do, and that we did, is tell them, insist, explain, provide evidence, provide the narrative and the evidence of what was going on the other side of the Atlantic. In the meantime, put our people in a safe mode. That's the maximum we could do. I think what we need now to push them is to cooperate. I think it's really crazy if this ends up in a scattered, semi-lockdown, confused situation, with countries opening up, others closing, borders being unclear between what comes in and what comes out. And I guess this G20 is a good opportunity for at least the G20 leaders to have unity on this standpoint. We cannot afford scattered approach and separated resolution on this COVID-19. It will take longer. It will result in a disastrous recession, I think.
Do you think, and I'm talking to both Werner and to Francesco, that there is now a greater sense of cooperation between the business community as they look to the future? I mean, is one of the good things that's going to come out of this, even if we don't have national cooperation, is greater business cooperation? Do you think, Werner or Francesco? Francesco,
yes,
and then Werner.
Or
Werner first.
I do think so. While that is certainly the fact right now, the big question is how do we preserve it? Yeah, because people will ultimately kind of gravitate back into their own businesses and focus on the task at hand that is most urgent. So that element of cooperation that is needed across different business sectors, across many of also other stakeholder groups, that needs to be maintained, but it will take some effort. If you go to the WEF, some of what we are talking about here, has been on the agenda for ages. To the extent that a problem is far away, it does not necessarily get the attention and the cooperation it really deserves. Now we are back into having a big problem at hand, and the big task at hand for us is now to keep it really on the forefront of our thinking and also our decision making in terms of priorities, in order to get the level of cooperation to a point that yields very different and substantially better results for the next crisis that we are going to get into inevitably, so that the level of preparedness is substantially better.
Right.
Liana, just want
Francesco,
to,
you have about 1 minute to give us a last rousing, enthusiastic word.
I would like just to add something, if you don't mind, Gian. This is Yousef again. I'm really very happy about the dialogue that we have heard from you guys. But I would like to just add, from a business community perspective, I think I am very optimistic from what I see from all leaders across the globe are willing to collaborate. And more importantly also, we are thinking outside of the G20. I mean, we are inclusive of other nations that probably they are in more need than the G20 countries. And that's something crucially positive from my experience. In addition, I think the G20, I have in my interface with them, they are calling up to B20 continuously to work with them and support them in their efforts and their packages and incentive programs. And at the same time, we need to be mindful that the G20 leaders or politicians, they do have also some challenges and limitations. So we need to think about the ways that we means to help them to overcome those challenges effectively. At the same time, I know Paul is very tough evaluator. I mean, giving the business community B+, that's really great. But I could see David is need more. And for me and my team in B20 and entire task force and members, I think we have a responsibility to bring it to A+ by the end of this year. So we'll do our best. Thank you.
Very good.
If I can say, Gillian, I just want to say that it is outstanding that we have, as we're talking, hundreds of millions of people disciplined at home. There are no riots in the streets so far. And it's amazing how the world, the people living around in the globe, have all understood what needs to be done. And they have all quite well stayed safe, being told what to do about it. So I think it's an incredible demonstration of what humanity can do once a goal is clear and once a direction is set. So let's not lose that. I think the business community is more united than ever in this. We have a common purpose, which is avoid a deep down recession, which can really break havoc in the system. And we still can make it, It all depends on how quickly this lockdown is successful and how quickly the system can restart.
Since we graduated from school,
I am quite optimistic. I mean, the people reacted very well.
So I think let's stay also positive, because since we graduated from school, we hope that we work from home and spend all our time with our family members and kids. So that's what we are doing today. So that's positive out of the COVID-19.
Absolutely. I mean, I've taken away sort of three key messages from this conversation, which has been truly fascinating, and I thank you. Firstly, there has been an astonishing amount of adaptation to a degree that, frankly, most of us would not have expected in recent weeks, whether it's learning to work from home, learning to work, spend more time with our kids, whether it's reaching out to colleagues. I mean, it's quite astonishing. Secondly, we're not going to go back to how it was pre-COVID. There really is a recognition that our approaches have changed and need to change, not necessarily as much as some people might like, but there does need to be a change, and there will be a change. But as you both said, the question of cooperation and how governments around the world support these extraordinary transformations in businesses is going to be absolutely critical. So that seems like a very good way to move into our third and last session. I'd like to say thank you very much indeed, both to Werner and to Francesco, for a truly fascinating discussion, really very interesting indeed. And we're now going to be turning to the key issue which has shaped all of our lives and is actually shaping how we are discussing holding the discussions right now, which is technology, but also the wider question of how we create more sustainable growth going forward. The title of the last panel is Charting the Course for Revival, How Technology Can Help the Economic Recovery, brackets, and it should add, keep us all sane as well. We have two fantastic people to talk to us in that respect. Jean Case, who is the chair of the National Geographic and the CEO of Case Impact Network, and author of a very relevant book. She's going to be telling us about too, I think. And Nasser Al-Nasser, who's CEO of SDC, who is looking at these issues from a public and private sector perspective. So I'd like to say, first of all, good morning to both of you, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are in the world right now. And I'd like to perhaps start by asking Jean to say a few words about what you think is a top issue right now in terms of creating sustainable growth in the world today. And are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, first of all, thanks, Jillian, and thanks to our organizers for this important conversation this morning. In some ways, I kind of want to reflect on some of the themes we've been talking about with the various speakers. As you mentioned, I had a book come out last year called Be Fearless, and it was based on social science that looked at principles that lead to breakthroughs, and often sustainable breakthroughs. And some of the themes from those principles came out in this morning's conversation. The first being let urgency conquer fear. And I think we heard great stories about how that's happening at the corporate level, but the truth is that's happening across sectors. Can you hear me okay, Jillian?
I can hear you fine, but you're slightly out of focus. So if you have maybe a question of just wiping the lens on your computer, this is all part of technological learning and innovation. If not, we can hear you fine, so we can get your message very clearly.
Did I correct it at all? Is it better now?
It's fine. Finish with your thought, and then when I turn to Al-Nasser, you can then jump in.
All right.
Yeah.
So the first is let urgency conquer fear. And as I said, we've heard a lot about what companies are doing, but it turns out that's happening in a very cross-sector way. The other principle is reach beyond your bubble. And that's really all about silo busting. And we've talked about collaborations among businesses. We've talked about collaborations with business and government. But the fact of the matter is, philanthropy and nonprofits and other sectors are also part of the solution here. And in my own background, Jillian, where I've come to crises before, it really has been when all sectors lock arms, work together, and chase towards innovation in an urgent way that we've seen breakthroughs. I know the AIDS pandemic was brought up earlier, but we saw that very clearly. But honestly, if you go back to the future, in times of the greatest challenges, it's no one sector that solves it. It's everyone locking arms, being a little more comfortable with taking risks, trying new things, and that's often what's led to breakthroughs.
Right, so it's not just a question of having this amazing business collaboration or calling for more governmental collaboration. It's also about thinking about collaboration across professional areas of expertise. Well, that's certainly a good.
You know, in capitalism and business, we tend to, particularly in America, be in the thrall of the idea of lone genius in the garage that comes up with great things. But this principle of reach beyond your bubble recognizes that when different people come together, different organizations come together, they not only broaden the perspective, but we cover each other's blind spots in areas where we may otherwise slip up or miss something. So it's really a powerful principle that I think couldn't be more appropriate for our time.
Right, right. Well, Mr. Al-Nassar, how does it look for you? Because you have an interesting role both since you're working in the private sector, but you're also very involved in the digitalization task force. So tell us how you see technology trying to build a better world or build back better in the future.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and you're also a guest, and glad to be with you today. I believe, first of all, there is a high degree of variability in terms of the forecast when this will go away. But I believe, irrespective of different country and different, opinions about when this will go away, there will be 6 to 9 months at least of social distancing and physical separation. How technology will play in that role, I believe it is important. And as your previous speakers mentioned, that the world post-corona is different than the world pre-corona. Considering this, I believe technology will continue to play a huge role into the analytics of the corona, into the prediction, into the physical separation, into the advices for people, into finding out more about it, being more proactive, alerting people about what's happening around them, the close vicinity, alerting government on what needs to be done and where and what time, what restrictions has to be made, what restriction has to be unlocked. So all these factors has to come through the technology. The only way is to utilize the digital world, the analytics, the machine learning, the artificial intelligence, into making these recommendations go forward and implementable in the world. We've seen even the reaction from country to country is different, and from company to company. Depends on the degree of the matureness of AI and machine learning, big data, etc., into how they to fight the coronavirus and how also to revive the economy. This is from one perspective. From the other perspective, which will be more lasting compared to what's happening during that period of the coronavirus, is the way of living, the way of doing business. I believe the online business will be the norm. We have in our company more than 95% today working remotely, and I've never thought that this will be the case. But I believe even after the corona, we will have globally between 50 to 70% of the companies, especially in the tech areas, working remotely, in some sort, whether a complete remote or partial or so. Virtual working will be one of the main norms going forward. The e-commerce and the digital applications, the cybersecurity enablement. Today we've been hearing, people were not working remotely, so that was not in their main plate or their main agenda. Today everybody speaks about privacy, about confidentiality, etc. So there will be new norms, and I believe the digital infrastructure will be the core of the new norms. The world post-corona will be completely different, and the fuel and the enabler of such a thing, whether during the 6 or 9 months or 1 year or whatever the prediction is, or post that, is the digital infrastructure and digital technology that will play the role.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, it would be interesting to do a survey of businesses, maybe through the B20, to ask what proportion of their workforce they do expect to be working remotely in the future. I mean, 50% or so, as suggested by Al-Nassar, is quite a high proportion. But I'd love to know whether that's going to be representative or not. But that also raises, if that is correct, it raises an interesting question about whether we have the tools to make access to digital working and learning equally dispersed? Are we going to actually have a more inclusive society as a result of this, or less? And what can businesses do in that respect?
I
want to
believe,
address that, Al Nassar, and then I'll ask Jean about that if she is on the line again.
sure, my pleasure. I believe it will be a collaborative between government and private sector. If we look today at the global scene of the connectivity or who is online, we have around 3 billion who's not online. 70 to 80% of that 3 billion is already in served area, but they don't have access, whether the financial access or whatever, and around 700 million, they don't have access. So the private sector and the government has to work together to make sure that there is access in terms of the financial and the ability to be able to use the networks and for the coverage in the different areas. So this is the first step, is to make sure that the infrastructure can provide the add-on from the digital service. And this has to be addressed. It's being addressed already at the GSMA table, at the ITU, and I believe now the momentum has to gather to make sure that such an infrastructure is ubiquitous, is globally, and is a basic right going forward. So I believe this is the first step. If we talk about the world, of course, private sector will play a role into the execution, but private sector cannot play all the roles. So there has to be an incentive from subsidies, from the other international agencies to make sure that this is happening.
Right. And Jean, are you on in the event? We may have had a slight. Jean, I can't see you, but I will. Do you want to comment on this? Because it'd be great to hear what your thoughts are on this as well.
Yeah, I'd love to, particularly in the realm of the digital divide. I think this is both the best of times and the worst of times. The worst of times in the sense for all of us to be productive right now, we have to have access, and as we know, there's inequality. The best of times is we're already seeing urgent measures to change the access and to improve the access. I'll give you 2 examples. Just today in the United States, the state of California's governor announced a very large business collaborative to open up access to 70,000 students who otherwise didn't have access to do their schoolwork from home. We're seeing this play out in other communities as well. In Africa, I sit on the board of a company called BRIC that says, we say we're taking the internet to the last mile. And there, companies have come in to help enable really thousands of new Wi-Fi hotspots. Again, not only so students can learn, do distance learning, but more importantly, so important directives and news about the virus itself, even hand washing instructions, et cetera, can be brought forward. Of course, we saw in Ebola, it was a big part of fighting that pandemic to make sure people had access with their phones to get critical information. And so it's a time where I think that problem has been there for a while, but what's happening is with urgency, the solutions are being brought forward.
That's fascinating. I mean, I must say, in the New York tri-state area, people are driving vans with Wi-Fi servers actually into poor neighborhoods to try and make sure that kids have access to Wi-Fi from their homes where you may not have such strong signals. I mean, there's a lot of creativity and excitement going on in that respect.
If I may add, Jillian, here, just some of the statistics we've made in our company, in STC, we've made a free access to all educational and health sites. And we've seen just some statistics, a 1,000 increase in the traffic in the educational sites after making this free of charge with the pandemic. So I believe that, we are always looking at the challenges, but the opportunity that come from these challenges is by itself, a case study for the future. How can we leverage such a thing for people who might not be able to make it in the future or for obvious reason in terms of efficiency, etc. So I just second what Jane mentioned, and I believe that this will be the new norm going forward.
Do you see any impediments to that, though, either in terms of, government getting in the way or private sector IP issues blocking that, or the debate about privacy? I mean, what are the challenges to ensuring we have good, fair digital access? I mean, Jean, I know you've been looking at this in the American context. Give us a sense of the American context, and then Al Nassar in the emerging markets in the Middle Eastern context.
Well, I'll point to two things in our past where we worked through a lot of those challenges. One was, there was a point in the late 80s where our schools were not connected. But in other places, something called Net Day, and literally all of the tech companies joined forces with the government and some nonprofits and philanthropies to, in pretty much one day, wire our schools. So we've seen really big ideas of big transformation come again through this cross-sector cooperation, and also this you just mentioned, Jillian, were as real back then as they are now. I think
Dean, I'd like to jump in just for 1 second, and because the Wi-Fi connection, illustrating our key discussion topic, is slightly breaking down. I think you might need to close the camera for a few minutes so that we can hear your voice properly, because we want to hear your voice above all else and get the message across. So if you can just repeat what you said in the last minute or two, and just tell us what you think, and then I think that we'll get a stronger signal that way.
Okay. Can you hear me well now, Jillian?
Fantastic. So we're sacrificing some visuals to hear the message more clearly.
Sorry about that. So I was simply reflecting on a huge initiative in America called Net Day that took place where literally almost every big tech company, together with governments and some nonprofits, in one day wired our schools, really pretty much one day. And they wired schools in a lot of neighborhoods that had been left behind. When we got started with our work in our family foundation, the Keys Foundation, one of the largest initiatives we put forward was called Power Up. And again, using collaboration of our partners in tech and governments and nonprofits, we put 1,000 after-school technology centers in low-income neighborhoods to really try to help the problem with the digital divide. So the bottom line is those challenges you spoke of earlier have been with us since the beginning of this sort of new tech world, but there are moments that are big moments and big ideas where those actually take a backseat to getting something done. And I think that's happening right now on the kind of digital divide efforts you're seeing going forward.
Thank you. Well, that's an excellent point. Al-Nassar, do you have anything to add to that from your perspective in terms of how to overcome these impediments? And I'm particularly curious about the privacy issue and how that plays out in your eyes.
I believe now that there is no a framework has to be developed by the privacy, because if you look globally with the regulations that's happening, countries that do not have that restriction have acted fast enough compared to countries who do have that restriction. So I believe part of having the analytics is the only way, and the big data / artificial intelligence is the only way to predict, to act fast, to make informed decisions on how to do this one and how to sustain business, because I cannot decouple what's happening at the pandemic itself to what's happening in the business. So you have to act in the same wavelength in the two dimensions. Without the right analytics, and here where the privacy comes. So I believe that there has to be a global initiative and countries-led initiative on how to differentiate and how to make sure that the issue of the privacy is maintained, yet it does not inhibit, protecting the overall, population and the overall businesses. So there has to be a balance and I believe that there has to be a radical change to some of the legislation in some of the countries to be able to make such, move and to reap the benefit of that decision.
Right. By the way, I should say, anyone watching or listening on the call, do please feel free to send over any questions through the chat function, because we'd love to incorporate that engagement into the discussion as we go forward. But I mean, Jean, what are your thoughts about the privacy issue? Because obviously in America, that has sparked a lot of soul searching and political angst in the last year or two. Do you think that we can overcome the privacy issues to kind of get to a more effective, widespread deployment of technology?
Well, I'm going to stay hopeful on that front, Jillian, but I don't think it's going to come out of self-regulation of the big companies. I think it really is going to have to be a collaborative where sort of the broader benefit to society is being considered. And that means some players coming in and having a role that are not just the companies providing, the technology themselves. It's funny, because in the 20 plus years I spent, there was a lot of collaboration among our companies and partners looking at things like like that. We came together really built some strong tools. I feel like we've been in a stage of technology where it's sort of more or less every man for himself or every woman for herself. And I think we really have to get back to actually what worked pretty well in the earliest days of technology, where companies come together around broader issues and invite outside stakeholders or their stakeholders in as part of the solutions that they build. And if I, that there was a lot of talk earlier about stakeholder capitalism, and I think, privacy is an example here. What happens, I think, in the midst of the crisis is, when you're in survival mode, it becomes eminently clear who and what you really need. And the bottom line is, you asked earlier if I'm an optimist. I'm encouraged by the new focus of workers, supply chains, and consumers. And I think if we see some of that continue out of this, it could be a path forward to some of the thornier issues that we just haven't been able to solve until now.
Right, right. Well, I very much hope so, because certainly we are seeing this crisis act as a catalyst to, inspire a lot more, unleash a lot more innovative and exciting thinking. We have a question from Fasa Al-Rahman Rasul from Al-Sharq Al-Aswad newspaper to the panelists, who says, what is the percentage of the global response in dealing with the epidemic and its impact on the business community? That's a very wide, very important question, but unfortunately, we may have lost some of the former CEO participants who perhaps would be best able to respond to that. But if Al Nasser would like to respond to that, do let us know. And the second question is, what is more important to the future of business? Is it finding a successful pandemic vaccine or relying on technology to revive the economy? Would either of you like to share any thoughts in relation to that, or the B20 host?
Well, thanks for the question when I ask. I will start by answering the first question. I believe it's not either or. The COVID-19 pandemic will not be the last one. So that once we resolve a vaccine for that pandemic, it is the end. So we need the technology as the foundation for a future resilience, for a future immediate action, for going around the solution. No matter, it's not going to be the last one. So I believe that enabling the technology, and technology, I might go, if you allow me just for a minute, that there are different levels of technology, because infrastructure is the basic thing. So talking about the infrastructure is an important. I'll just tell you an example of what happened in Saudi Arabia. There was an initiative started by the government three years ago for some subsidies, which paid off today. We were ranking in the mobile speed 105. Today we are ranking number 10 globally. I believe if we were at that stage, and the pandemic happened, we will not have coped with 30 to 40% increase in the traffic. The whole thing will collapse, and we have seen collapses everywhere. So this is one. There was also another initiative for additional 3 million household connection in the fiber. So today we are reaping the benefits. So we have to start always from the infrastructure. The infrastructure is the most basic thing, that it has to be advanced enough to make sure that it can cater for whatever comes on top in terms of digitization. The framework, legal framework. Today we have seen during this pandemic an increase in the e-signature of 100% just during the pandemic. We have the legal framework, and we have one of our companies which is responsible for the financial service. The whole year, whatever money transferred through 2018 has been transferred up to now during the year. So you see how is this impacting the consumer behavior, online business. The last mile delivery has increased 7 times compared to before the pandemic. So I believe that it has to work together in tandem and in parallel with the regulation, with the incentive, with the business sectors themselves. But the ultimate goal is to reach a combination of the right connectivity, whether a fiber or 5G, the right clouds, and the right data sets that will enable a fast reaction and a fast response to the issue.
That's fascinating. Jean, do you have any thoughts on this?
I thought that was a really great summary. I think that, look, it's very clear where we need to go. And I think this time can create a path forward in ways we just haven't been able to sort of take the risk before now and make an urgent solution.
What about the issue about choices between resiliency and sustainability? We have a very interesting question from Lippman, who says the recovery fueled by public money needs to add to the environmental sustainability in a systemic way. Can tech be part of that solution? Do we think enough about the environmental footprint of the tech sector when we're looking at these issues, for both good and bad? Because, of course, servers can require a lot of energy sometimes, and they're not always quite as clean and green as people might think or hope.
Can I take that question, start with that?
Yes, exactly.
I believe that, going green now and the net zero emission, let me take the communication sector. Now there is a declaration from most of the operators globally for a net zero emission by 2050. So I believe that it's not either or. We have to march and enable the digitalization infrastructure, but we have also to be cautious about the sustainability and how is the impact. We have to bring technologies that is more efficient in terms of emission, etc. So we have to. The more advancement in the technology, the more help we will have in these fronts. So I believe that they are coupled together, and we'll see them marching together because of the regulation, because of the impact, because of the cost efficiency. It's not only, it is a business today to be, an efficient and going green and sustainable. Is a business need as much as it is, an economy need or a public need.
Jean, do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, most definitely. Are you kidding? From my perch at National Geographic, it's something I care passionately about, especially with Earth Day coming this week.
Back tomorrow, yes.
Yeah, you see Microsoft and Amazon make strong moves towards net zero. I think the key here in the work I've done with corporate CEOs in the U.S. and really places outside the U.S., we have to make sure that some of the commitments that are being made, and I think, I think this point was just made, you can't look at 2050 and make a commitment. You really have to be on that path right now to have legitimacy in this space. And what I will say is the demographic shifts taking place not just in the United States, but around the world, where women and millennials are playing a much stronger role, both as consumers and growing investors. Companies understand this will not be a choice. They know that they will be judged on how they're doing against sustainability. So there is a strong business interest. And again, I'll underscore the point, what we're seeing are some great examples of companies as they've gotten into this, they realize it's really helped the bottom line as well. So, I'm encouraged here, but I think we just have to make sure that when companies are speaking to this, they're taking action right now towards a future commitment.
That's fascinating. Well, we're going to be hearing in the next session from Rania and Ashar about some of the gender implications of what's going on, which is going to be very interesting indeed. But we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to ask one other question, which is that we discussed in the first session about how this crisis has really fostered or forced some sense of humility, or at least it should do, because no matter how big your country, no matter how elite you may seem to be, no matter how advanced you may seem to be, the pandemic has shown that that alone is no protection against the virus. And often it's smaller countries which are doing better in terms of response. But in some ways, looking forward to the issue of tech raises questions about global collaboration and mutual learning as well. Because in some ways we are entering a period of not just innovation, but reverse innovation, where bright ideas are cropping up all over the place. I'm often very struck by the one laptop per child program in America, which essentially took simple, cheap laptop technology developed outside the developed world and essentially tried to distribute access to laptops very widely. I'm curious, are you hopeful that we are going to see more innovation, reverse innovation, cross-border learnings on a more equal basis going forward? Perhaps Al-Nasser would like to address that, because of course your company has been very involved in trying to take innovative ideas globally.
Definitely, I believe that this it's not anymore a choice, whether it's sharing data or sharing technology. I'll just give one example on how technology coupled with the data and artificial intelligence change the whole ecosystem of handling the pandemic. There is, if you go to the lung computerized tomography, this usually takes 15 minutes to 20 minutes of analysis by high experts. Today, with artificial intelligence, it takes from 10 to 20 seconds to identify, is it related to coronavirus or is it related to other lung issues, with a 94% accuracy. So you can limit, what goes to the high-level physicians to another 6% only, or 10% or whatever from that one. So I believe a data sharing, a collaborative approach is not a choice anymore. It is the norm of the post-corona world going forward.
Jean, what about you? How do you see this, both in terms of the data sharing issue, but also the innovation and reverse innovation question of good ideas hopping across borders in some unexpected ways?
I'm super optimistic based on what I'm seeing right now, but also what history teaches us about this moment. But I think the broader point here, and you started with this in your question, Jillian, look, I think this is a time, a defining moment around leadership. And we know that the greatest leaders, more social sciences coming out around this, lead with empathy. And I think, one of the things we're finding is that opening their eyes, being more empathetic, just heard from a gathering of 40 Fortune CEOs recently who had their eyes open to some of the struggles that particularly working moms have, et cetera. And they've said they will be changed by that. So this defining moment for leadership, I think what we'll see going forward is some who will embrace what they've learned and what they've opened their eyes to in this time, and they'll adapt in ways that will benefit society broadly, and then others who maybe just won't get it. But the bottom line is people are watching, and this is definitely a defining moment for leaders.
Well, that seems like a great moment to end with, and also it really touches on the key theme of this whole panel discussion, which is there is real reason for optimism. And heaven knows we need all the optimism we can get right now and all the chances to celebrate the type of innovation that you're both involved with. But as you say, Jean, and as you've also touched on, Mr. Al-Nasser, this is not going to be harnessed automatically. It does require both global cooperation, which is where the B20 and G20 are so important now, but also real leadership in both the public and private sector. So I guess what I'd say from that is good luck to both of you as you go forward, not just trying to cope with the current crisis, but chart a better course going forward. And in many ways, that's a perfect segue, because we're going to be turning now to the next and last panelist in this morning's discussion, which will be a fireside chat with Rania Nasha, who is very well placed to pick up on some of the themes that Jean just spoke to about the women on the front lines, and really the question of how this crisis is equality. Rania Nasha is CEO of Samba Financial Group, and she's chair of the B20 Women in Business Action Council, which is trying to put the issues of economic empowerment of women at the top of the agenda. So thank you both to Jean and Mr. Al-Nasser, and welcome. Good morning to Rania. I hope you can see me, and we can't quite see you yet.
I can see you very well.
Okay, fantastic. Good morning. Right.
Good
Well,
morning.
thank you and welcome, and thanks for joining us this morning. So you are in a very interesting role, because the issue of women hasn't been discussed that much thus far in the debate. It's been slightly crowded out by many of the other stories, speaking of the journalist. But you're arguing that it's time to start looking more at the issue of gender equality right now, or gender issues.
Great, yes. This is actually the right time for discussing the gender equality issue. As you know, now in the COVID-19, it's becoming now the most repeated public information that 70% of the workers in the healthcare are women. So those women are the ones who are risking their lives, trying to save everyone's life, and they are at the forefront in this dealing with this pandemic issue. Not only that, what we are currently seeing, a lot of challenges are being imposed on women who are at the workforce. And especially, as you know, 740 million women globally are working in the informal economy. And in continents like Africa, for instance, 70% of women employment is in this informal economy, and majority of them are working in agriculture. And this means that if those women lose their job, then we will have issue finding food for ourselves. So a lot of challenges are COVID-19 brought to women on their personal life and their professional life, because those women, after they come back from their work until today, and you have heard it from the great panelists this morning, that we are still, when it comes to work-life balance, still women are doing the unpaid family care work. They come back from their work now, especially the woman who works in the social and the healthcare, and they take care of the education of their kids who are studying now remotely to make sure that they have better future and better contribution to the economy. So this is an added burden. Not only that, majority of women are expected to take care of the elderly people that they are responsible for. So it's again additional responsibilities and more responsibilities for women. And that's why now it's the right time to make sure that we align ourselves and actually be thankful and grateful for all these women and try to mitigate all the risks that they are facing, as well as helping in resolving all these challenges. So I believe that it's an urgent need to make sure that women are engaged in all the decision-making processes. And I can't say more, after what Dr. Nabarro has mentioned, that, he mentioned two countries, Germany and Singapore, that they have the best response to the COVID-19 challenges, and those countries are ruled by women. So this shows how diversity and gender equality is important at this time.
Right. Well, certainly I know that right now many women are facing a tough burden at home, along with many men, of course, as well. One of the funniest videos I saw in the early days of the crisis was from a harassed mother who did a wonderful, I think it was an Instagram post saying that if the coronavirus doesn't kill me, homeschooling will, and talking about the horrors of trying to homeschool children at the same time as doing a job. And of course, many men are facing that challenge as well. But unfortunately, it often does tend to be the women who are juggling most of all. And that's just the professional women who are lucky enough to be able to work from home and have all those blessings associated with that. But I have before we come on to the question about the B20 task force that you're leading and what you're going to do, we already have a great question from Dr. Nauf Al-Gamdi, who says, how do you think COVID-19 crisis will affect women's roles globally and reduce a gap in gender equality? And will it open up new sectors for women depending on the technology development? How will that develop?
Okay, so I will just go through the question. So first of all, the word, as Nasser mentioned in the previous panel, the word before COVID-19 is not like the word post-COVID-19. And I believe that COVID-19, especially when we were talking about women in the healthcare sectors, this really shows now the importance of that everyone is talking about vaccine, about research. So there's now a great need to close the gap for women in this sector, because we still need more biologists, we still need more women working in medicine, and we need women who work in research. And this actually will open more opportunities for women to progress in these fields. Not only that, working remotely now is becoming the norm, and working remotely is giving more flexibility for women, because we've been advocating for decades and decades to have more flexible working policies. And now with having the whole world is being run through virtual meetings and through remote access, this really will open up more opportunities for women who can really access the work from their home while having the flexibility to do the other expected roles from them.
Right, right. And just to pick up on the rest of the question from Dr. Nalv Ankati, how do you see that impacting the economy more widely?
Actually, it will impact the economy positively because, as you know, women are 50% of this whole world population, but their participation in the economy or in the decision making or policy making or even in leading companies or in the workforce is still below that. Until now, there's a big gap of women in the workforce versus men in workforce by almost 27%. And this gap, and I believe that the more opportunities women will have, the more flexibility in the working norm, this will increase the participation for women, and the more diversified working place, it has been proven throughout majority of the studies, be it McKinsey, be it BCG, you name it, it all shows that the more inclusive and diversified environment, the more profitable the companies are, the more innovative, and the growth rates are much higher.
Right. So in terms of, I mean, the B20 has created this COVID-19 task force. How is your task force dovetailing with that in terms of trying to put women's issues on the agenda going forward? Are there specific steps that you're seeking to ask governments and businesses to take?
Definitely. Actually, when we started this task force, and this was before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were focusing mainly on three priorities to make sure that there's a level playing field, and we are boosting the female businesses and entrepreneurship, as well as amplifying synergies. And now with the challenges that COVID-19 has brought on the table, we have worked closely with all the task forces within the B20, as well as other engagement groups like the W20, the L20, and the C20, towards working in synergy and making sure that we address the gaps across all levels. So first of all, we want to address the gap in digitalization. We want to address the gaps for women as employees, as well as the gaps for women as workers. And finally, and not at least, the last but not least, as addressing the gap for women in the leadership position or in the decision making. So if we talk about the digitalization, what we are aiming for is not only to have access to the digital economy, but also to have the digitalization as affordable for women, because this will make sure that they can help their kids to study remotely, or they can help the woman herself to work remotely while taking care of others. So it's not only about accessing digital, but having digital being affordable. Secondly, when we talk about the inclusion in the decision making, this shows that the more we create pipelines for women, the more the diversified the economy is, and the more the outcome of that economy will be. And then we talk about women as both employee and employer. When we talk about employee, we've been happy about, the over-representation of women in certain sectors like hospitality, tourism, retail, and we were happy about that. But the issue now that these sectors are the most impacted by the COVID-19. And when they will start laying off some of their staff, women will be severely impacted. So we are trying to get the right support system for those women to be kept in their job. Not only that, women as owners of business, and especially when it comes to micro, small, medium enterprises, in the pre-COVID-19, there were studies where it shows that 2/3 of the women who are pitching for investment, they are seeing the investors are not taking them seriously as men, and they are not really having the same access to financing programs and the support programs by the government entities. So what we are trying to advocate for is to make sure that these women, we have the right policies, and the decision makers are really helping towards creating the right incentives for the businesses to keep the women, as well as to boost their businesses and to support them to get out of the COVID-19 in resilience manner. And that's why I want here to echo what Mr. Polman was mentioning, that it's not all about private sector and what the private sector can do. The G20 and the government, they have announced a lot of stimulus and support programs, and they have to create incentives to support the women. The G20 must also offer support to female business owners and those at risk of losing their jobs. So what we are trying to support for, despite all these supports that we're getting from the government, is to create something that can last post COVID-19 and post the G20 this year, which is more of helping those females who are facing challenges, whether to work or to finance their businesses, by creating a crisis fund for female-owned businesses, for the micro, small, and medium enterprises. And here it's basically, it should be more of a government call that is supported by the private sector. And such funds should have the right and clear legislations for the regulators to make sure that it has all the forms of gender-based discrimination, and it has to have unconscious bias towards, the inclusions and the decisions around the job creations, or when it comes to job cuts during the crisis now, or in the future causes, if any, crisis story.
Right. I mean, presumably, though, one of the biggest impediments is the question of domestic labor and childcare and things like that. And obviously, every culture is very different and every situation is very different. But do you think there needs to be more explicit discussion of, sharing, say, responsibility for children and education, things like that?
Definitely. I believe that now it's the right time to have more what I call it family-friendly policy. So it's not like, female-friendly, it's more of family-friendly, because now our norm now is that male and female, both of them are working remotely from home. So they have also to share the child care and the family care unpaid work. Currently, women are doing 3 more times than what men is doing, and this was pre-COVID-19. I believe this has to be continuously at the forefront when discussing family-friendly policies. There should be incentives towards, both female and female when it comes to parental vacations or allowances, or it has to be always that this needs to be addressed. Not only that, also the unprivileged workers, and those are mainly women. So formalizing their jobs and making sure that they get the right incentives, and the private sector, when it gets those right incentives, they will make sure that they hire more female. And we have seen that in some of the countries where they have imposed the quota on women in leadership positions, although at the beginning it was more of parachuting and just making sure that they're filling the gap. But by the time it really shows that women are the more diversified leadership positions, this is better for the economy. In addition to that, when we talk about education, I believe now this is the right time to close the gaps when it comes to education. And especially with the more digitalization, this will make sure that the woman can get the right education wherever she is.
Right, thank you. Well, sadly, very sadly, we are indeed out of time now, but I think I'd like to say on behalf of everyone who's watching, particularly the women who are watching, thank you very much indeed for what you're doing, and very best of luck in driving this agenda forward, because it is indeed very important, but has not necessarily been discussed enough in public yet. So thank you very much indeed. And we are now wrapping up, coming to the end of this morning's or this afternoon's discussions. And having heard this discussion, it really does strike me that we are at an extraordinarily important point in global history. We've had an incredible amount of disruption unleashed by the pandemic, and in some ways it's the first big, truly disruptive shock that's arisen as a result of 21st century globalization. But the same channels that have enabled the pandemic to move around the world at terrifying speed also contain reasons for hope. We have an information system that is knitting the world together more closely than ever before, as seen by the fact we have this incredible virtual conference happening right now. We have the potential to learn from each other, for brilliant ideas to spread, whether it's in terms of policies on gender or science or pandemics or how to organize companies. And it's very clear that harnessing this collaboration is absolutely going to be central to whether or not we can overcome these shocks. And they're not just medical shocks, it's the economic shock and the social shock as well. It's not necessarily guaranteed that there will be the collaboration that's needed to really harness these potential opportunities. As David Nabarro indicated so clearly, and Paul as well, and also we heard from the CEOs, there have been big impediments to global collaboration in recent weeks, and those may continue to linger. But collaboration really is going to be critical to trying to deal with this. So I congratulate the B20 for organizing this event this morning, and I really do wish you the very best of luck in trying to take forward this agenda. And last but not least, we're going to hear from the B20 Sherpa, Dr. Abdul Wahab Al-Sadoun, who's going to be talking about how he hopes to take forward, or how, as leader of the B20, the group hopes to take forward some of these very important initiatives. So, Dr. Al-Sadoun, over to you.
Thank you, Gillian. I'd like to start by extending my deep appreciation and thanks to you for doing a great job, engaging the thought leader, the business leader in the previous is truly thought-provoking, and we appreciate your management of those sessions. Given that we have only short time, I'd like to jump on my closing remarks and start with one of my favorite proverbs from Henry Ford, who once said, "Coming together is the beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success." And we embarked on this B20 journey back in December 1st, and since then we've been moving forward thanks to the shared purpose and the commitment of the task force member. We have over 1,063 from the G20 and beyond as member of the task forces, and I'd like to take this opportunity to extend our deep appreciation for their commitment and for the leaders also of the task forces and the Action Council. I'd like to briefly touch on several key initiatives which are related to the COVID-19, which is the focus of this plenary. And firstly, the B20 had launched an initiative, the B20 COVID initiative, that had been alluded at earlier by our chairman. And it's a cross-border, cross-sector initiative which aims to come up with an impactful policy recommendation to the G20 to mitigate the impact of the pandemic from health, social, and economic perspective. It entails, policy recommendation and advocating those recommendations, and also highlights what business needs from the government at present, and how business and government can, work together, and need to highlight, the issues and prepare, for the future in case we will encounter crisis of that caliber or even worse. And the bottom line, that is the emphasis of this initiative that had been also highlighted by several of the panelists, including Dr. Nabarro, is the need for a global leadership, coordination, collaboration, and solidarity is needed now more than ever before. Within this initiative, we've been, doing several engagements and campaigns right from the beginning of the outbreak of the coronavirus. End of February, early March, we came up with the COVID-19 initiative announced by our chairman. Following that, we had a joint letter with the WHO and the ICC addressed to the leader of the G20 in their extraordinary summits on 26th of March. And post this summit, we've also released a statement commending the leaders in their summit and also commending them for capturing many of the recommendations that had been highlighted by the B20. We went ahead also with another joint statement from the other engagement group, namely the L20, the W20, addressing issues related to the manpower and the impact of man, skill as well, which was well received. Another statement had been issued recently in April, which is preceding the G20 finance minister virtual meeting. And again, many of the business community's positions and recommendation had been captured. We have several recommendations and statements in the pipeline, and this meeting, the virtual plenary, is one of them related to the COVID-19. Just to highlight what had been captured also in our open letter to the G20, several of the recommendations that had been highlighted from a public health and economic health had been captured. I'm not going to go through each of those recommendations, but they had been captured in the summit, in the G20 Leader Summit statement. Another initiative we are working on, which is work in progress, is an interim report to the G20 addressing the COVID. And this is focusing on jump-starting the economy post the COVID-19. What are the policy recommendations needed to ensure jump-starting the economy in that phase? And here the objective is to provide a short-term, timely, and actionable policy recommendation addressing the social, economic, and health crisis. To make it more inclusive, we're drawing input from the B20 Executive Committee, comprised of 21 leaders, also the Business Advisory Caucus, comprised of 35 global companies and organization leaders, the network partner, and the knowledge partner, and it's expected to be finalized in June 2020. On the other initiative is on SMEs. SMEs is one of the topics which is cross-cutting all the task forces and the Action Council within the organization of the B20. And knowing that the SMEs is more exposed to the impact of the epidemic, we've joined hands with the business at OECD in developing a policy paper which is focusing on what need to do to help the SME jumpstart the global economy in the currently and post the COVID-19 phase. It's addressing the need for the SMEs to operate cross-border, and any legitimate SMEs which has been incorporated within one of the G20 countries can operate within the other countries, subject, of course, to the intergovernmental agreement. So this will hopefully, help addressing the issues related to the SMEs and help the SMEs that will be more impacted, severely impacted, to be more specific, by the COVID impact. On the though that we are focusing more time and resources and effort to address the ramification and impact of the COVID-19, but nevertheless, we're also working on other policy recommendations. All the task forces and the Action Council are working to ensure that A, they stick to the timeline and the schedule, and B, come up with the right policy recommendations. So at present, for instance, in April, we had all the joint task force meeting, which was scheduled to be held earlier, prior to the COVID-19 in Washington, D.C., but we had to turn to a virtual meeting attended by over 500 task force members. And the level of completion for the policy recommendation is in the tune of 70. Some of the task forces has even exceeded this percent. So we are on track when it comes to the policy recommendation as we work, as we speak. What's next? We're refining the recommendation. From now on, we have, as outlined in the previous slide, 3 more teleconferences between the task forces, and hopefully by end of June, we will have the final recommendation. We'll consolidate the recommendation from the 6 task forces and the Action Council, come up with a report to the G20, and hopefully this will be submitted to the B20 Summit on time, and submitted, to the G20 Summit ahead of their summit in November in Riyadh. This brings me to the end of my closing remarks. I again would like to extend my thanks and appreciation to the leaders who had shared with us their wisdom, insight on the COVID and what needs to be done, from a governmental as well as from business perspective. And I'm, glad to hear that Polman had scored, B+ for the business community. And as our chairman outlined, we aspire, by the end of the year, to score A or even A+. It is doable with the commitment and the dedication that we have from the task forces, from the Secretariat. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank every one of them for their commitment, for their hard work. And I'm sure that by the end of this year, hopefully we will convene in Riyadh in the B20 Summit, and the COVID-19 will be behind our back. So thank you once again, and all the best. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.